In a prestigious Chicago law firm, Matilda Roberts was about to receive the most devastating news of her life. What started as a routine will reading took a shocking turn when she discovered her parents had left her exactly $1, while her brother inherited $15 million. Matilda wasn't your typical disappointment. For 30 years, she had dedicated her life to social work, known for her unwavering compassion for the homeless and forgotten. When she received a mysterious letter 3 months later, she had no idea she was walking into her grandmother's carefully orchestrated plan. Eleanor's secret $20 million trust fund would challenge everything Matilda believed about family, forgiveness, and her own worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a chasm. Matilda Roberts sat rigid in the leather chair, her thrift store blazer a stark contrast to Derek's tailored suit. The scent of old money and legal briefs hung heavy in the air at Whitman and Associates, the same prestigious Chicago firm that had handled her parents' affairs for decades. To my son, Derek Roberts, I leave the entirety of my estate, valued at approximately $15 million, including all properties, investments, and business holdings. Derek's fingers stopped their nervous drumming against his Rolex. The relief that washed over his face was unmistakable. A man who'd been holding his breath for weeks, finally exhaling. He glanced at Matilda with what might have been sympathy, but she knew better. It was the same look he'd given her when they were children, and she'd lost another spelling bee, another science fair, another chance to make their parents proud. To my daughter, Matilda Roberts, Whitman continued, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, I leave the sum of $1, along with this note. The elderly lawyer slid a crisp dollar bill across the polished surface, a small piece of paper attached with a paperclip. Matilda's hands trembled as she reached for it, the simple action feeling like reaching across an ocean. The note was written in her father's precise handwriting. For someone who values money so little. The words hit her like a physical blow. Even from the grave, Robert Roberts couldn't resist one final lecture about her life choices, one last reminder that she had disappointed them. Her throat constricted as she stared at the dollar bill, feeling the weight of 30 years of subtle rejections crystallized into this moment. Maddie, I'm sorry. Derek's voice seemed to come from very far away. I had no idea Dad would— Of course you didn't. The words escaped before she could stop them, sharp enough to cut through the formal atmosphere. You never had to worry about what Dad would do, did you? She remembered the Christmas morning when she was 12 announcing her dream to become a social worker. Her mother's face had gone pale, as if Matilda had declared her intention to become a street sweeper. Darling, Linda had said in that particular tone reserved for disappointments, perhaps you should think about something more substantial. Derek's going to be a lawyer. Derek had been 17 then, already accepted to Northwestern on a partial scholarship. Their father had beamed with pride, talking endlessly about his son's future. But when Matilda spoke about helping homeless families, about making a difference in people's lives, the conversation always seemed to shift to Derek's accomplishments. The reading is concluded, Whitman announced, shuffling his papers with practiced efficiency. If you have any questions about the estate's administration, Derek, my office will be in touch within the week. Matilda stood on unsteady legs, the dollar bill crumpled in her fist. The room felt like it was spinning, the weight of a lifetime's worth of second-place finishes pressing down on her shoulders. She needed air, needed space, needed anywhere but here. Maddie, wait! Derek's hand touched her shoulder, but she shrugged away from him. Congratulations, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You got everything you ever wanted. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and found herself in the marble lobby, then the revolving door, then on the sidewalk where Chicago's autumn wind cut through her inadequate jacket. The city noise, honking horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the L train surrounded her like a cocoon of anonymity. The law firm's bathroom had offered a temporary refuge. Matilda had locked herself in the handicapped stall, pressing her back against the cold metal door as the tears finally came. 30 years of trying, of hoping, of believing that maybe if she just worked hard enough, cared enough, sacrificed enough, their parents might finally see her worth. But even in death, they had chosen Derek. Even when there was more money than either of them could spend in a lifetime, they had given her a single dollar and a note that felt like a slap across the face. Her small apartment in Wicker Park felt even more cramped when she returned, the mismatched furniture and thrift store finds suddenly looking shabby rather than charming. She collapsed on her secondhand couch, still clutching the dollar bill, and called the one person who had never made her feel like a disappointment. "Carmen," she said when her best friend answered on the second ring, "they gave Derek everything." Carmen Rodriguez had been her anchor since college, the kind of friend who showed up with ice cream and righteous anger whenever life knocked Matilda down. Within an hour, she was sitting cross-legged on the couch, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a double shift, holding Matilda while she cried. "Your parents were idiots," Carmen said bluntly, her slight accent thickening with emotion. "You save people's lives every day. You find homes for families living in their cars. You work yourself to death for people who can't pay you back, and they think that's worth less than Derek's corporate law bullshit?" "Maybe they were right," Matilda swippered into her shoulder. "Maybe I should have chosen something more practical. Maybe I am a disappointment." "Stop!" Carmen pulled back, her dark eyes fierce. "Don't you dare let their twisted priorities make you doubt yourself. You are exactly who you're supposed to be." But the words felt hollow against the weight of that final rejection. When Derek called Jada that evening, his voice carefully modulated with what he probably thought was compassion, Matilda let it go to voicemail. She couldn't bear to hear his excuses, his awkward attempts to make sense of their parents' decision. "Maddie, it's me. Look, I know today was difficult. Maybe we could have dinner this week, talk things through. I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us." But it changed everything. It was the period at the end of a sentence she'd been trying to write her entire life, the final proof that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough for the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Matilda sat in her kitchen, surrounded by case files from the community center where she worked. Families facing eviction, children sleeping in cars, elderly people choosing between medication and food. These were the people who valued her work, who saw her worth even when her own parents couldn't. The dollar bill lay on the table beside her laptop, its message as cutting now as it had been in the lawyer's office. She thought about framing it, a permanent reminder of the cost of choosing compassion over profit. Or maybe she'd donate it to the center, let it help someone who actually needed it. Outside her window, Chicago settled into evening, the city lights blinking on like distant stars. Somewhere across town, Derek was probably celebrating in his Lincoln Park penthouse, raising a glass of expensive wine to his good fortune. And here she sat, exactly where she'd always been, on the outside looking in, wondering if her parents had been right about her worth all along. The silence of her apartment pressed against her like a weight, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren. Tomorrow she would return to work, throw herself back into helping people who had even less than she did.
The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and grandmother's eyes, smiled warmly as she approached. "Ms. Roberts, Mr. Morrison is expecting you. He's been looking forward to this meeting." James Morrison's office was nothing like the cold formality of Whitman and Associates. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal texts, but also novels and poetry collections. A small Japanese garden occupied one corner, complete with a miniature bridge and carefully raked sand. The man himself rose from behind an antique desk, tall and distinguished, but with the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Miss Roberts," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." She settled into a leather chair that had seen decades of clients, its worn arms comfortable rather than imposing. Morrison poured tea from an elegant set. Jasmine tea, she realized with a start, the same blend Eleanor used to serve during their quiet afternoons together. "You're wondering why you're here," Morrison said, settling back into his chair. "I imagine the letter raised more questions than it answered." "I don't understand any of this," Matilda admitted. "My grandmother. She wasn't wealthy. My father always said she lived on Social Security and whatever my grandfather left her." Morrison's smile held secrets. "Your father knew only what Eleanor wanted him to know. She was a remarkably private woman when it came to her finances. He opened a thick folder, revealing documents that looked decades old. Eleanor Fujimoto was one of the shrewdest real estate investors I've ever known. She started with a single duplex in 1962, reinvesting every dollar of profit. By the time she passed, she owned properties across 3 states. Matilda's hands trembled as Morrison spread photographs across the desk. Apartment buildings, small office complexes, a shopping center she recognized from the South Side. This is impossible. She lived so simply. She lived according to her values, not her bank account, Morrison said gently. Eleanor believed wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege. She wanted to ensure it went to someone who understood that distinction. The next document made Matilda's vision blur, a trust fund statement with her name at the top and a number that couldn't possibly be real. 20 million, she whispered. Million, yes. Morrison's voice carried the weight of years, but Eleanor's gift comes with conditions. He pulled out an envelope sealed with red wax, her name written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. Inside, her grandmother's voice seemed to speak from the pages. My dear's Matilda, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered what I kept hidden from your father all these years. I built this fortune not for comfort, but for purpose. You have shown me a heart that values people over profit, compassion over conquest. But money can corrupt even the kindest soul, so I have designed challenges, tests of your character, that will prove you worthy of this inheritance. Complete them with integrity, and this fortune is yours to use as your conscience guides. Fail, and everything returns to the charities that have long held my support. Trust your heart, child. It has never led you astray. With endless love, Nana Eleanor. Morrison handed her a second envelope, smaller and sealed. The first challenge. Eleanor was very specific about the timing and conditions. You have 1 year to complete all tasks. Each builds upon the last. What if I can't do them? The question escaped before she could stop it. Then you'll be no worse off than you are now, Morrison said kindly. But Eleanor watched you for 30 years, Matilda. She saw how you chose service over salary, how you fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She believed in you when your parents couldn't see past their own expectations. Tears blurred her vision. Her grandmother, quiet, humble Eleanor, had been watching, understanding, believing. While her parents measured worth in dollars and status, Eleanor had seen something deeper. Derek doesn't know, Morrison continued softly. Eleanor specifically excluded him from this trust. She felt his values had been shaped by other influences. The weight of it crashed over her. Not just the money, though 20 million was incomprehensible, but the validation. Someone in her family had finally chosen her first. Someone had seen her worth, not despite her choices, but because of them. There's something else, Morrison said softly. Eleanor left recordings, messages for after each challenge, explanations of her reasoning. She wanted you to understand not just what she was giving you, but why. Matilda clutched the challenge envelope, feeling its weight. Her entire life had led to this moment. Every disappointed look from her parents, every dollar she'd stretched to help a client, every night she'd chosen service over self-interest. When do I start? She asked. Morrison's smile reminded her of Eleanor's, patient, knowing, full of quiet faith. Whenever you're ready. But remember, these challenges aren't just about proving yourself to Eleanor.
They're about discovering who you truly are when faced with the power to change everything. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside the office windows, Chicago stretched endlessly, a city full of people who needed exactly what Eleanor was offering. Not just money, but someone who understood that wealth meant nothing without compassion. The first challenge waited in her hands, sealed with her grandmother's love and faith. For the first time in 3 months, Matilda felt something other than grief and rejection. She felt chosen. She felt ready. The real test was just beginning. Matilda's hands shook as she broke the red wax seal, alone in her apartment with only the distant hum of traffic for company. Eleanor's elegant script emerged from the envelope like a message from another world. First challenge:
Help someone who cannot repay you, and do not let them know the source of their salvation. True compassion requires no recognition, no gratitude, no credit. Find someone in genuine need and become their anonymous guardian angel. Use the preliminary funds Mr. Morrison has provided, but remember, the gift must remain secret, the help must be significant, and your heart must be the only witness to your generosity. A cashier's check fell from the envelope, $10,000 from the trust's preliminary account, more money than Matilda had ever held at once, earmarked for someone else's salvation. Her mind immediately went to Marcus. 2 weeks had passed since their conversation at the center, and his situation had only worsened. The city had cleared his makeshift camp in Millennium Park. His disability check had been delayed again by bureaucratic tangles. Most crushing of all, he'd been accepted into a job training program for building maintenance, real work, honest work that could lead to steady income, but needed a medical clearance he couldn't afford. $300 for the physical, Marcus had told her yesterday, his weathered hands turning his worn baseball cap in endless circles. Might as well be $3,000. Program starts Monday, with or without me. But how could she help him without revealing the source of his salvation? Marcus had pride, the hard-earned dignity of a man who'd served his country and refused handouts. He'd reject charity, especially from someone he saw as barely scraping by herself. The answer came through Alex Kumar. She'd met Alex at an interagency meeting 3 months ago, drawn to his quiet intensity as he spoke about bridging gaps between nonprofit organizations. He worked for Chicago Cares Coalition, coordinating emergency aid between various charities. Something about his approach, methodical but warm, pragmatic but hopeful, had stayed with her. "I need your help with something unusual," Matilda said when she called him. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to provide anonymous assistance to a homeless veteran, how would they do it? Alex's laugh was warm over the phone. Hypothetically? That's very specific. But I'd say the key is creating a believable story, maybe an emergency grant from a foundation that prefers to remain anonymous. Happens more often than you'd think. They met at a coffee shop near the coalition's offices. Alex was smaller than she'd remembered, with kind dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm presence that made people trust him instinctively. When she explained Marcus's situation, carefully omitting her own windfall, his expression grew thoughtful. "The Riverside Foundation," he said after a moment. "They do emergency assistance for veterans, usually stay anonymous to avoid being overwhelmed with requests. I could reach out to them about Marcus." "What if they say no?" "Then I tell Marcus that a private donor heard about his case and wants to help. Happens sometimes. Anonymous business people, church groups, people who've been where he is." Alex studied her face. "This hypothetical helper wouldn't happen to be you, would they?" Heat rose in her cheeks. "I just think he deserves a chance." "He does," Alex agreed. "But Matilda, this kind of help, medical expenses, training costs, temporary housing, we're talking significant money. Are you sure you can afford this?" She thought of Eleanor's check, of $20 million earning interest while Marcus slept on park benches. "I'm sure." The next week unfolded like clockwork. Alex contacted the Riverside Foundation, who agreed to cover Marcus's medical expenses as part of their veteran assistance program. When that proved insufficient for the full scope of help Marcus needed, Alex presented the private donor story with such conviction that even Matilda almost believed it. The medical clearance came through on Friday. Housing assistance appeared through an emergency voucher program that Alex somehow expedited. The training program welcomed Marcus with open arms, praising the anonymous donor who'd made it possible. Watching Marcus sign his training paperwork, Matilda felt something she'd never experienced before. Not the hollow satisfaction of completing a required task, but genuine joy that needed no recognition, no credit, no external validation. His smile when he told her about his lucky break was worth more than any gratitude he might have offered if he'd known the truth. "Someone up there must be looking out for me," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years thinking nobody cared, turns out there's still good people in this world." The irony wasn't lost on her. For 30 years, she'd craved recognition from her parents, desperate for acknowledgement of her worth. But helping Marcus, truly helping him, with no possibility of credit or thanks, filled a space in her soul she hadn't known was empty. That evening, she called Morrison to report the challenge's completion. "Eleanor would be proud," he said quietly.
She often said that the truest test of character was what someone did when no one was watching. How many more challenges are there? 4 more, each more difficult than the last. His voice carried a note of warmth. But if the first is any indication, you're exactly who Eleanor believed you to be. As she hung up, Matilda realized something had shifted. The desperate need for her parents' approval had begun to fade, replaced by something stronger, the knowledge that her worth wasn't determined by others' recognition, but the quiet choices she made when no one was keeping score. Eleanor had seen it all along. Sometimes the most powerful gifts were the ones given in shadow, witnessed only by the heart that offered them. Part 5. Derek's desperation. The penthouse that had once symbolized Derek Roberts' success felt like an elegant prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lincoln Park, but Derek saw only the reflection of his own hollow eyes staring back from the glass. The $15 million inheritance sat tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far, tied up in probate complications, real estate transfers, and investment portfolios that his father had specifically structured to prevent quick liquidation. "Smart man, your old man," Vincento Morello had said during their last meeting, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone accustomed to being feared. "Made sure you couldn't just cash out and disappear."
Shows he understood you better than you thought. The memory sent ice through Derek's veins. Morello and his associates didn't care about probate timelines or fiduciary responsibilities. They cared about the $200,000 Derek owed them, money that had disappeared into online poker sites and cryptocurrency gambles that it seemed like sure things at 3 in the morning. His phone buzzed with another text from his contact at Sterling Morrison and Associates. Expected liquidation timeline, 4 to 6 months minimum. Some assets may take longer. We'll update as situation develops. 4 to 6 months. He had 2 weeks. Derek poured another scotch, his hands steadier than they'd been in days. The Macallan 25 had cost $800, purchased back when money seemed infinite and consequences were abstract concepts. Now it tasted like desperation and regret. "Derek?" Sarah's voice echoed from the hallway, sharp with the particular tension that had defined their marriage for the past 6 months. "We need to talk." She appeared in the doorway of his study, still wearing her pediatrician's coat from the hospital. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, accentuating the exhaustion in her eyes. Once she'd looked at him with admiration, maybe even love, now she studied him like a particularly challenging diagnosis. "I found the credit card statements," she said without preamble, dropping a stack of papers onto his desk. "The ones you've been hiding in your office at the firm?" Derek's stomach dropped. The American Express account he'd opened without telling her, the one he'd used for cash advances to cover gambling debts, $47,000 in 3 months, all of it gone into the digital casino that had consumed his nights and destroyed his judgment. "Sarah, I can explain, can you?" Her voice cracked with something that might be hope, if hope could sound so broken. "Because I've been trying to understand for months. The late nights, the mood swings, the way you check your phone every 30 seconds like you're waiting for something terrible to happen." She picked up one of the statements, her hands trembling slightly. "Cash advances, Derek. $47,000 in cash advances. What did you need cash for?" "The like came automatically, polished by months of practice. Investment opportunities, quick turnarounds that required stop." The word cut through his explanation like a scalpel. "Just stop lying to me. I'm a doctor, Derek. I recognize addiction when I see it." The word hung between them like a curse, addiction, as if what he was doing was some sort of disease instead of a perfectly rational response to temporary financial pressure. He wasn't some street junkie or falling down drunk. He was a successful lawyer making strategic investments that hadn't panned out yet. "It's not addiction," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "It's a cash flow problem. Once the inheritance clears, the inheritance that's tied up for months," Sarah's laughter held no humor. "Derek, I talked to my brother. He's a financial advisor, remember? He explained how estate liquidation works. You're not getting that money anytime soon." Panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. If Sarah knew about the timeline, if she understood how precarious their situation really was, she might start asking questions about his other activities. The client funds he'd borrowed from his firm's escrow account. The forged documents had bought him another month's breathing room. "Marcus is wrong," Derek said. "These things can be expedited. There are ways, like the way you expedited our mortgage payment last month," Sarah's eyes flashed. "I called the bank. We're 3 months behind. 3 months. On a mortgage you told me was automatically debited." The scotch turned to acid in his mouth. He'd been so careful, so meticulous about hiding the mounting catastrophe of their finances. But Sarah was too smart, too thorough. Of course she'd eventually start digging. "It's temporary," he said, hating how desperate his voice sounded. "How?" Sarah's voice broke completely now. "By gambling more? By taking bigger risks? Derek, I found the second mortgage papers. You put our home up as collateral for what? Another chance to lose everything." He couldn't meet her eyes. The second mortgage had seemed billion at the time, leverage our home equity for a substantial cash infusion, double it at the poker table, and pay everything back before Sarah ever knew. Except he hadn't doubled it. He'd lost it all in a single night of increasingly desperate bets. "I can win it back," he whispered. "I know I can."
"I've studied the patterns. I understand the mathematics. Listen to yourself." Sarah's voice carried the careful control of someone addressing a patient in crisis. "Derek, you're sick. You need help. I need time." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Below, couples walked their dogs through the park. Children played on swings, normal people living normal lives unburdened by the weight of impossible debts and closing windows. "Just a few weeks, the inheritance will clear, everything will be fine." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. What if the probate took longer than expected? What if his father's careful structuring made liquidation even more difficult? What if Morello ran out of patience before the money came through? An image flashed through his mind. Matilda in her thrift store blazer, looking lost and broken at the will reading. Matilda, who'd always been content with so little, who'd never understood the pressure of expectations and responsibility. What if their father had hidden other assets? What if there was money somewhere that nobody knew about? "I'm taking Emma to my mother's," Sarah said quietly. "We'll stay there until you figure out whether you want to be her father or just another casualty of your own selfishness." She left him standing at the window, her footsteps echoing through the penthouse like the countdown to an execution. Derek pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the private investigator his firm sometimes used for witness location. Matilda had seemed different lately, more confident, less beaten down. And that mysterious letter she'd tried to hide during his visit, there had been something about it, something that set off every alarm bell his lawyer's instincts possessed. If there was family money she knew about, money that rightfully belonged to both of them, he needed to find it, not because he was greedy, but because he was desperate. Because 2 weeks was all the time he had left before desperation became catastrophe, and catastrophe became the kind of ending that destroyed everything he'd ever claimed to love. Tony Riggs answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and cynicism. "Riggs Investigations?" "Tony, it's Derek Roberts. I need surveillance on someone. My sister. I think she might be hiding assets from our parents' estate." The lie came so easily it frightened him. But sometimes survival required compromising truth, and Derek Roberts had become very good at surviving, no matter the cost. Part 6, Challenge 2, The Test of Forgiveness. The second envelope from Eleanor arrived on the Tuesday morning that already felt weighted with unfinished business. Matilda opened it at her kitchen table, surrounded by case files and the remnants of another instant coffee breakfast. Eleanor's handwriting seemed more urgent this time, as if her grandmother had known this challenge would test her most deeply. Second challenge. Forgive someone who has wronged you deeply, and take action to heal the wound between you. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is the courage to choose love over bitterness. But true forgiveness requires more than words. You must act with compassion towards someone who has hurt you, seeking not to punish, but to understand, not to wound, but to heal. Remember, my dear one, resentment is a poison we drink hoping others will suffer. The only antidote is the choice to love anyway. Derek. The name rose in her mind unbidden, carrying with it 30 years of accumulated hurt. But how could she forgive someone who'd never acknowledged wrongdoing? How could she heal a wound when the other person didn't even recognize they'd inflicted it? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Coffee later? Have something interesting to show you about the veteran housing project." Their friendship had deepened since Marcus's success story. Alex had an easy way of making her laugh, of seeing possibility where she saw only problems. Sometimes she caught herself watching the way his hands moved when he talked, or noticing how his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was dangerous territory for someone carrying Eleanor's secret, but increasingly impossible to ignore. The coffee shop near the coalition offices had become their regular meeting place. Alex was already there when she arrived, a manila folder spread across the small table, his face animated with the kind of excitement that meant he'd found a solution to an impossible problem. "Okay, so I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about systemic change versus individual help. What if there was a way to do both?" He slid a proposal across the table. "Transitional housing project, not just emergency shelter, but actual apartments where people can rebuild their lives. Job training partnerships, mental health support, childcare, real solutions, not just Band-Aids." Matilda studied the numbers, her pulse quickening. The project was ambitious, comprehensive, exactly the kind of initiative she dreamed about during her late-night case reviews. But the funding requirements were staggering, nearly $3 million for the first phase alone. "This is incredible," she said, trying to keep the excitement from her voice. "But Alex, the budget," she said. "I know it seems impossible, but I've been researching major donors' foundation grants. Sometimes you have to dream big to make real change." His eyes met hers across the table. "What would you do if money wasn't an obstacle, if you could design the perfect program?" The question hit her like lightning. Here was someone who understood her vision, who saw the same problems she had been fighting against for years, someone who believed in solutions rather than just surviving the status quo. "I'd want wraparound services," she said, leaning forward, "not just housing, but addressing the root causes. Trauma counseling, addiction treatment, job skills training. Most importantly, treating people with dignity instead of just processing them through the system." "Exactly." Alex's smile was radiant. "That's exactly what this could be." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice behind her. "Well, in this cozy."
"You've been hard to reach lately." His tone was casual, but his gaze kept returning to the proposal documents. Busy with work, I see. New projects? Alex extended his hand with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in any situation. Alex Kumar, Chicago Cares Coalition. You must be Derek. Matilda's mentioned you. Has she? Derek's handshake lingered a moment too long, his lawyer's instincts clearly cataloging every detail about Alex. And what exactly does the coalition do? Coordinate services for homeless and at-risk populations, Alex replied. Your sister's one of the best advocates in the city. We're working on some innovative housing solutions. Something flickered across Derek's face, calculation mixed with what might have been envy. Housing solutions. Expensive, I'd imagine. Derek, Matilda interrupted, alarm growing at his probing questions. Is everything okay? You seem tired, he finished for her. Work's been intense lately. Actually, I was hoping we could talk, privately. His eyes flicked meaningfully at Alex. Alex gathered his papers with practiced ease. I should get back to the office anyway. Matilda, think about what we discussed. Maybe we could meet again this week to talk through some ideas. After Alex left, Derek slid into the vacant chair without invitation. Up close, the signs of strain were more obvious. Shadows under his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands, the particular brittleness of someone operating on nervous energy alone. You look good, he said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. Different, more confident. Thank you? She wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment. Things have been difficult since Mom and Dad died, Derek continued, his voice carefully modulated. I know the will was hard on you. I've been thinking maybe we should talk about it. About family. Eleanor's challenge echoed in her mind. Take action to heal the wound between you. This was her opportunity, perhaps the only one she'd get. But the way Derek kept glancing around the coffee shop, the tension radiating from him like heat, suggested this conversation wasn't about healing. I'm sorry about how things went at the reading, she said carefully. I know it couldn't have been easy for you either. Something that might have been relief crossed his features. It wasn't. I never wanted there to be this distance between us. We're family, Maddie. The only family either of us has left. Then why does it feel like you're interrogating my friend? Why are you looking at me like I've done something wrong? The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his lawyer's composure slipped, revealing something desperate underneath. I'm not... He stopped, running his hands through his hair. Look, things have been complicated lately. Financially. The inheritance isn't as liquid as I thought it would be. What do you mean? Dad structured everything to prevent quick access. Smart estate planning, terrible timing. Derek's laugh held no humor. I'm cash poor despite being worth millions on paper. It's ironic, really. Matilda felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite sympathy, but recognition. Derek was struggling. The golden child who'd always seemed to have everything was asking for help even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say the words directly. How can I help? He asked. The question seemed to startle him. Help? You're my brother, Derek. Despite everything that's happened between us, despite Mom and Dad's choices, you're still my brother. If you need help, I want to give it. For a heartbeat, she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that reminded her of the boy who'd once built blanket forts with her on rainy afternoons. But then his walls went back up, pride and suspicion warring across his features. I don't need help. But the words lacked conviction. I wanted to make sure you're okay. You seem different lately. Like maybe something has changed in your life.
There it was, the real reason for this conversation. Derek suspected something, and his lawyer's instincts were probing for weaknesses in her story. The question was whether his suspicion came from genuine concern or something more calculating. Things have been better at work, she said truthfully. I feel like I'm finally making a real difference. That's good. That's really good. But his eyes kept drifting to her purse, where Eleanor's letter remained carefully hidden. Just remember, if anything changes, If you ever come into any money or opportunities, family should come first. We should look out for each other. The statement hung between them like a trap waiting to be sprung. Matilda realized with crystalline clarity that Derek wasn't here to reconcile. He was here because he suspected she had access to something he needed, and his desperation was making him reckless. Eleanor's challenge suddenly made perfect sense. Forgiveness wasn't about Derek deserving it. It was about Matilda choosing love over the bitter satisfaction of watching him struggle. It was about seeing past his desperation to the wounded person underneath and offering help even when it wasn't appreciated or understood. "Derek," she said gently, "whatever you're going through, whatever you need, I'm here. But I can't help you if you won't tell me what's really wrong." His mask slipped again, just for an instant, and she saw the truth. Her brother was drowning, and pride was the anchor dragging him under. The question was whether he'd let her throw him a rope, or if his desperation would turn him into something even more dangerous. The choice, Eleanor's voice whispered in her memory, was always love, even when love looked like setting boundaries, even when forgiveness required courage rather than surrender, even when the person who needed healing most was the one least likely to accept it. Part 7. Secrets and Surveillance. Tony Riggs had been following people for 23 years, and Matilda Roberts was either the most boring subject he'd ever surveilled or the most careful. For 2 weeks, her routine had been numbingly predictable. Community center, grocery store, occasional coffee meetings with the nonprofit guy, home to her modest apartment where lights went out by 10:30. But routines told stories to those who knew how to read them, and Riggs was fluent in the language of human behavior. The new clothes, subtle but definitely higher quality than her usual thrift store finds. The confident posture that hadn't been there a month ago. The way she checked her phone with the particular frequency of someone expecting important calls. Most telling of all, the visits to Morrison and Associates. Riggs adjusted his telephoto lens from across the street, watching Matilda emerge from the downtown law firm for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Each visit lasted exactly 90 minutes, each time she left looking thoughtful rather than distressed. Whatever business she had with Morrison, it wasn't bad news. His phone buzzed with Derek's now daily check-in call. "Anything?" Derek's voice carried the tight control of someone barely keeping panic at bay. "She's definitely meeting with James Morrison regularly," Riggs reported. "Estate attorney, high-end clientele, been in practice 30 years, specializes in trusts and inheritance planning." The silence on Derek's end stretched long enough that Riggs wondered if the call had dropped. "Derek, you there?" "Morrison." Derek's voice was barely a whisper. "James Morrison. I know that name." Riggs waited. Desperate clients often remembered crucial details when pressure mounted. "My grandmother," Derek said slowly. "Eleanor Fujimoto. I remember now, she mentioned a lawyer named Morrison once, years ago, but she never had any money. Social Security, maybe a small savings account?" "People hide things," Riggs said pragmatically, "especially family money. Sometimes the quiet ones are the smart ones." Derek's breathing was audible over the phone. "Keep watching her. I need to know everything. Who she meets with, where she goes, what she's doing with that money." "What makes you think there's money?" "Because she's acting like someone who just won the lottery but doesn't want anyone to know." After Derek hung up, Riggs settled back into his surveillance position. The desperation in his client's voice was becoming more pronounced with each call. In his experience, desperate people made poor decisions, and poor decisions often led to the kind of confrontations that required his more specialized services. He made a note in his file. Subject may need close protection soon. Client increasingly unstable. Meanwhile, Derek sat in his car outside Morrison and Associates, staring up at the building's glass facade.
The temptation to march inside and demand answers was almost overwhelming, but his lawyer's training held him back. Morrison was bound by attorney-client privilege. A direct approach would only alert Matilda that he was investigating her. But there were other ways to gather information. He pulled out his phone and called his contact at the Illinois State Bar Association. "It's Derek Roberts. I need a favor. Background information on a colleague. James Morrison, Morrison and Associates downtown." "That's easy," Jenny said after a moment of typing. "Morrison's been around forever. Impeccable reputation, specializes in estate planning and trust administration. Big money clients, very discreet." "Why the interest?" "Potential conflict of interest on a case I'm working on," Derek lied smoothly. "Any recent significant probate filings?" "Nothing I can access without specific case numbers." "But Derek, Morrison's not the type to get involved in anything questionable. If you're thinking about going after him professionally." "Nothing like that," Derek assured her, though his mind was already racing. Trust administration.
Discreet. Big money clients. All of it pointed to one conclusion. Eleanor had hidden a fortune, and somehow Matilda had found it. The injustice of it burned like acid in his throat. He was the one who'd sacrificed his 20s to law school, who'd built a successful practice, who'd made their parents proud. Matilda had chosen social work. Noble, perhaps, but hardly the path of someone who deserved millions. His phone rang. Vincent Morello. "Derek, my friend, time's getting short." "I know, I'm working on it." "Working on it how? Because from where I sit, you're no closer to payment than you were 2 weeks ago." Derek closed his eyes, feeling the walls closing in. "There may be family assets I wasn't aware of, money that should have been part of the estate." "Should have been?" Morello's voice carried dangerous amusement. "That sounds like lawyer talk for, 'I don't have your money.'" "I'll have it. One way or another, I'll have it. For your sake, I hope so, because one way or another is exactly how we handle people who disappoint us." The line went dead, leaving Derek staring at his reflection in the car window. 24 hours. That's what Morello had given him the last time they'd spoken. 24 hours to produce $200,000 or face consequences that his imagination preferred not to explore. That evening, Matilda sat across from Alex at a small Italian restaurant near her apartment, the third challenge envelope unopened in her purse. The weight of Eleanor's secrets was becoming harder to bear, especially as her feelings for Alex deepened. Every shared laugh, every moment of connection felt built on a foundation of deception. "You're distracted tonight," Alex observed, twirling pasta around his fork. "Bad day at the center?" "Not bad, exactly. Just complicated." She watched his hands as he ate, noticing the way he gave her his complete attention even during casual conversation. It was such a contrast to her family's dynamics, where attention was earned through achievement rather than simply given through affection. "Want to talk about it?" The simple question nearly undid her. When was the last time someone asked what she needed without expecting something in return? When had anyone offered to listen to her problems without immediately trying to solve them or dismiss them? "Alex," she said carefully, "if someone you cared about was keeping a secret, not because they wanted to hurt you, but because they had to, would you be able to forgive them?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That's a very specific hypothetical question." "I know. Are we talking about a secret that affects me directly, or something personal that they're not ready to share?" The distinction surprised her. Most people would have immediately demanded to know what she was hiding. Personal. Something that doesn't change who they are, but might change how you see them. Alex set down his fork, giving her question the serious consideration it deserved. "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone has the right to privacy, to decide when and how they share difficult things. The question isn't whether someone keeps secrets, it's whether they're trustworthy in the ways that matter. And how do you know if someone's trustworthy? You watch how they treat people who can't help them, how they act when they think no one's watching, whether their actions match their values." His eyes met hers across the table.
You worried too much about other people's judgment, Matilda. Anyone worth knowing will see your heart first. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only deepened her guilt. Alex was falling for someone who was lying to him about the most fundamental aspect of her current life. How could she judge whether their connection was real when it was based on incomplete information? "There's something I need to tell you," she began, then stopped as her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your brother hired a private investigator to follow you. Thought you should know. Be careful. A friend." The blood drained from her face. Derek wasn't just suspicious, he was actively investigating her. The careful game she had been playing, the delicate balance of secret meetings and normal routines, had been compromised. "Matilda, what is it?" Alex reached across the table, his touch gentle on her hand. She looked at him, kind, patient Alex who believed in her completely, and realized that Eleanor's challenges had just become infinitely more complicated. Because now she wasn't just being tested on her character, she was being hunted by her own brother, a desperate man who saw her secret as his salvation. The third challenge waited in her purse, but first she had to survive the consequences of the second. Forgiveness, it turned out, was a luxury she couldn't afford, when the person she had tried to forgive was actively working to destroy her. "I need to go home," she said, gathering her things with hands that shook despite her efforts to appear calm. "Alex, talk to me. What's wrong?" But there was no way to explain without revealing everything, and revealing everything meant putting not just her inheritance at risk, but Alex's safety as well. Because if Derek was desperate enough to hire surveillance, he was desperate enough for almost anything. The game Eleanor had designed to test her character had just become something much more dangerous, a battle for survival against someone who knew exactly how much she had to lose.
Matilda's hands were still shaking when she reached her apartment. The anonymous warning text burned into her memory. She'd barely turned the deadbolt when Thunder's knocking shook her door. "Matilda, open up. I know you're in there." Derek's voice carried a desperation she'd never heard before. Raw, unhinged, dangerous. Through the peephole, she could see him pacing in the narrow hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled. Behind him stood a bulky man in a cheap jacket who could only be the private investigator. "Derek, what are you doing here? We need to talk, now." His voice cracked with barely controlled hysteria. "About Eleanor, about the money you've been hiding from me." Her stomach dropped. The careful house of cards she'd built around Eleanor's challenges was collapsing, and Derek's desperation made him unpredictable. She opened the door but kept the chain engaged. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't." Derek's face appeared in a gap, his eyes wild with something that might have been panic or rage. "Don't lie to me anymore, Maddie. Tony here has been very thorough. 3 visits to Morrison & Associates, new clothes, new confidence, money you shouldn't have." The investigator, Tony, stepped forward, producing a manila folder thick with photographs. "Morrison specializes in trust administration, big money trust, your grandmother's trust specifically." Derek pushed against the door, his voice rising. "Eleanor left money, didn't she? Millions of dollars that should have been part of Dad's estate. Money that belongs to both of us." "Derek, you're scaring me." "I'm scaring you?" His left held no humor. "I'm about to lose everything, Matilda. My house, my marriage, possibly my life, and you're scared. Do you know what happens to people who owe Vincent Morello money and can't pay?" The name meant nothing to her, but the terror in Derek's voice told her everything she needed to know. Her brother hadn't just made poor investments. He borrowed from dangerous people. "Let me in," Derek pleaded, his anger dissolving into desperation. "Please, Maddie, I'm drowning here. Sarah left me, took Emma. The firm fired me yesterday when they discovered the missing client funds. I have hours, maybe less, before men show up who won't be satisfied with explanations." Against her better judgment, she unlatched the chain. Derek stumbled inside like a man escaping a storm, Tony following silently. Behind, up close, Derek looked even worse, hollow-eyed, trembling, the polished facade completely stripped away. "How much?" Matilda asked quietly. "200,000, but with interest and penalties?" Derek's voice broke. "I need 300 to make this go away completely." The number was staggering, but not impossible. Eleanor's trust could cover it easily. But giving Derek money wouldn't solve his gambling addiction. It would only enable it, buying temporary peace before the next crisis. "Derek, you need help. Real help. Counseling, treatment." "I need money." The words exploded out of him. "I don't have time for therapy, Matilda. I have hours, before they come for me, before they hurt people I love, to make a point." Tony cleared his throat. "Perhaps if Miss Roberts shared the details of this trust, we could find a mutually beneficial solution." The suggestion hung in the air like a threat. Matilda realized with crystalline clarity that she was trapped between Derek's desperation and his investigator's cold pragmatism. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding it. "There is a trust," she said carefully, "but it's not what you think." "How much?" Derek's eyes locked onto hers with laser intensity. 20 million, but Derek, there are conditions." The number hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against her kitchen counter. 20 million, and you were going to let me lose everything, let men kill me over pocket change? Eleanor's dead. Her instructions don't matter when people are in real danger. The door burst open behind.
"I've studied the patterns, I understand the mathematics. Listen to yourself." Sarah's voice carried the careful control of someone addressing a patient in crisis. "Derek, you're sick. You need help." "I need time." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Below, couples walked their dogs through the park. Children played on swings, normal people living normal lives unburdened by the weight of impossible debts and closing windows. "Just a few weeks, the inheritance will clear, everything will be fine." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. What if the probate took longer than expected? What if his father's careful structuring made liquidation even more difficult? What if Morello ran out of patience before the money came through? An image flashed through his mind. Matilda in her thrift store blazer, looking lost and broken at the will reading. Matilda, who'd always been content with so little, who'd never understood the pressure of expectations and responsibility. What if their father had hidden other assets? What if there was money somewhere that nobody knew about? "I'm taking Emma to my mother's," Sarah said quietly. "We'll stay there until you figure out whether you want to be her father or just another casualty of your own selfishness." She left him standing at the window, her footsteps echoing through the penthouse like the countdown to an execution. Derek pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the private investigator his firm sometimes used for witness location. Matilda had seemed different lately, more confident, less beaten down. And that mysterious letter she'd tried to hide during his visit, there had been something about it, something that set off every alarm bell his lawyer's instincts possessed. If there was family money she knew about, money that rightfully belonged to both of them, he needed to find it, not because he was greedy, but because he was desperate. Because 2 weeks was all the time he had left before desperation became catastrophe, and catastrophe became the kind of ending that destroyed everything he'd ever claimed to love. Tony Riggs answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and cynicism. "Riggs Investigations?" "Tony, it's Derek Roberts. I need surveillance on someone. My sister. I think she might be hiding assets from our parents' estate." The lie came so easily it frightened him. But sometimes survival required compromising truth, and Derek Roberts had become very good at surviving, no matter the cost. Part 6, Challenge 2, The Test of Forgiveness. The second envelope from Eleanor arrived on the Tuesday morning that already felt weighted with unfinished business. Matilda opened it at her kitchen table, surrounded by case files and the remnants of another instant coffee breakfast. Eleanor's handwriting seemed more urgent this time, as if her grandmother had known this challenge would test her most deeply. Second challenge. Forgive someone who has wronged you deeply, and take action to heal the wound between you. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is the courage to choose love over bitterness. But true forgiveness requires more than words. You must act with compassion towards someone who has hurt you, seeking not to punish, but to understand, not to wound, but to heal. Remember, my dear one, resentment is a poison we drink hoping others will suffer. The only antidote is the choice to love anyway. Derek. The name rose in her mind unbidden, carrying with it 30 years of accumulated hurt. But how could she forgive someone who'd never acknowledged wrongdoing? How could she heal a wound when the other person didn't even recognize they'd inflicted it? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Coffee later? Have something interesting to show you about the veteran housing project." Their friendship had deepened since Marcus's success story. Alex had an easy way of making her laugh, of seeing possibility where she saw only problems. Sometimes she caught herself watching the way his hands moved when he talked, or noticing how his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was dangerous territory for someone carrying Eleanor's secret, but increasingly impossible to ignore. The coffee shop near the coalition offices had become their regular meeting place. Alex was already there when she arrived, a manila folder spread across the small table, his face animated with the kind of excitement that meant he'd found a solution to an impossible problem. "Okay, so I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about systemic change versus individual help. What if there was a way to do both?" He slid a proposal across the table. Transitional housing project, not just emergency shelter, but actual apartments where people can rebuild their lives. Job training partnerships, mental health support, childcare, real solutions, not just band-aids. Matilda studied the numbers, her pulse quickening. The project was ambitious, comprehensive, exactly the kind of initiative she dreamed about during her late-night case reviews. But the funding requirements were staggering, nearly $3 million for the first phase alone. "This is incredible," she said, trying to keep the excitement from her voice. "But Alex, the budget," she said. "I know it seems impossible, but I've been researching major donors' foundation grants. Sometimes you have to dream big to make real change." His eyes met hers across the table. "What would you do if money wasn't an obstacle, if you could design the perfect program?" The question hit her like lightning. Here was someone who understood her vision, who saw the same problems she had been fighting against for years. Someone who believed in solutions rather than just surviving the status quo. "I'd want wraparound services," she said, leaning forward. "Not just housing, but addressing the root causes. Trauma counseling, addiction treatment, job skills training. Most importantly, treating people with dignity instead of just processing them through the system." "Exactly." Alex's smile was radiant. "That's exactly what this could be." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice behind her. "Well, in this cozy." She sat beside him, seeing not the entitled lawyer who'd inherited everything, but the scared little boy who'd once crawled into her bed during thunderstorms. "Derek, I can get you the money. Tonight.
All of it. His head snapped up, hope flaring in his eyes. But, she continued, there are conditions, real ones. You have to admit you have a gambling addiction. You have to enter treatment, and you have to stay for the full program. How long? 6 months minimum. Derek's face crumpled. Matilda, I'll be dead in 6 hours. I can't. Or, she interrupted, I can pay Morello tonight. No questions, no conditions. But if I do that, there's no safety net next time. No family money to bail you out when this happens again. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Derek's breathing was shallow, rapid, the sound of someone drowning in impossible choices. It's going to happen again, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Isn't it? Even if you pay him, even if I promise to quit, it's going to happen again. The admission broke Matilda's heart and filled her with hope simultaneously. This was the first time Derek had acknowledged the pattern, the compulsion that drove his self-destruction. Yes, she said gently. Without help, it probably will. Derek buried his face in his hands. I can't stop, Maddie. I've tried so many times. I tell myself this is the last bet, the last game, but then something triggers it, and I'm right back there. Sarah knew. That's why she left. She left because you lied to her, not because you're sick. There's a difference. What if Morello doesn't wait? What if he comes after Sarah and Emma to get to me? The question hit like ice water. Matilda hadn't considered that Derek's debts might endanger innocent people, his estranged wife and daughter who had no role in his gambling debts. Then we call the FBI, Carmen said from the doorway. Morrison stood behind her, his elderly face grim but determined. Threatening family members is federal extortion. We document everything, get protective custody if necessary. Derek looked up at the small group assembled around him. His sister, who'd offered help despite his betrayal, her friend who'd shown up for moral support, an elderly lawyer who'd stayed past midnight to solve a stranger's crisis. You'd really do that? He asked. Risk federal charges, protective custody, all of it? For me? Your family, Matilda said simply. Broken, complicated, infuriating family, but still family. The question is, are you ready to get well or just ready to get rescued? Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression, not the manic desperation of earlier, but a strange kind of calm. If I admit myself to treatment tonight, right now, can you guarantee Sarah and Emma will be safe? Morrison nodded. I have contacts in federal law enforcement. Protective custody can be arranged within hours. And the treatment center. Best facility in the country. They have beds available tonight. Derek took a shuddering breath. Then I want help. Real help, not just money to make this go away until next time. The words hung in the air like a prayer, fragile but genuine. Matilda felt Eleanor's presence in the room, her grandmother's wisdom vindicated by Derek's choice to face his demons rather than simply run from them. Thank you, Derek whispered, though whether to her or to Eleanor's memory, Matilda couldn't tell. For the first time in months, her brother looked like someone worth saving. 6 months later, Matilda stood in the garden of the Westside Community Center, watching Alex direct volunteers as they installed raised beds for the Healing Garden project. The September air carried the promise of autumn, and she marveled at how much had changed since that devastating day in the lawyer's office when she'd received her symbolic $1. The center's new transitional housing facility stood gleaming across the street. 32 apartments, a child care center, job training facilities, and counseling offices. The Eleanor Fujimoto Foundation had made it possible, along with partnerships Alex had cultivated with a dozen other organizations. It was everything they'd dreamed about during that coffee shop conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. The Morrison Trust Fund is officially clothed, Jameis Morrison announced, approaching with a manila folder thick with documents. At 73, he moved more slowly than he had during those midnight crisis meetings, but his eyes still held the warmth that had made him feel like family from their first meeting. All challenges completed? Matilda asked, though she already knew the answer. With distinction. Eleanor would be proud. Morrison handed her the final documentation. The full $20 million is yours, along with the additional investment growth. But I suspect you already have plans for it.
She did.
The foundation was just the beginning. There would be more housing projects, more programs addressing root causes instead of just symptoms. But most importantly, there would be Derek. A car pulled up to the curb, and her brother emerged from the passenger side, followed by his sponsor, Marcus, the same veteran Matilda had helped during her first challenge. Life had a way of creating perfect circles, she'd learned. Derek looked different. Healthier, certainly. The hollow-eyed desperation replaced by something that resembled peace. But more than that, he carried himself with the particular humility of someone who'd faced their worst self and chosen to change. 6 months clean, he announced as he approached, his smile tentative but genuine. 1 day at a time, but 6 months. How are you feeling? Matilda asked, studying her brother's face for signs of the old restlessness. Terrified, Derek admitted with a laugh that held more honesty than humor, but grateful. Every day, grateful. He gestured toward the housing facility. Sarah brought Emma by yesterday to see the progress. She said to tell you thank you. The reconciliation between Derek and his wife was proceeding slowly, built on the careful foundation of honest communication and professional counseling. Emma had started visiting Derek at the center where he'd begun volunteering, teaching legal aid workshops for residents. The little girl who'd once asked why Daddy didn't read bedtime stories anymore now helped him organize law books for the center's resource library. Speaking of Sarah, Carmen said, appearing with Alex from the garden area, she wants to know if you're bringing someone to Emma's birthday party next weekend. Matilda felt heat rise in her cheeks as Alex grinned. Their relationship had deepened slowly after she'd finally told him about Eleanor's inheritance and the challenges she'd faced. His response had been characteristically thoughtful. I fell in love with who you are, not what you have. The money explains some things, but it doesn't change anything that matters. I haven't decided yet, she said, though they all knew she had. Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. There's one final element to Eleanor's plan that I haven't shared yet. He produced a sealed envelope, this one addressed to both siblings. To be opened only after Derek completed his program and Matilda finished her challenges. Derek and Matilda exchanged glances before Derek nodded for her to open it. Inside was a photograph of Eleanor as a young woman, standing beside a man Matilda didn't recognize. On the back, Eleanor's handwriting. Your grandfather, 1961. His gambling addiction destroyed our first marriage, but his recovery saved our second one. Love and accountability can coexist. Below the photograph was a letter. My dear grandchildren, if you are reading this together, then you have both learned what took me decades to understand, that love without boundaries is not love at all, and that the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to become their best self. Derek, your path was always going to be harder because addiction is a family inheritance I had hoped would skip your generation. But recovery is also a family inheritance, and you carry your grandfather's strength as well as his weakness. Matilda, you have learned that wealth is not about money, but about character. Not about what you can take, but about what you can give. The true inheritance was never the funds in the trust. It was the person you became while earning them. The foundation you will build together will be my legacy, but more importantly, it will be yours. Take care of each other. Take care of the vulnerable. Take care of the part of our family that extends beyond blood to include every person who needs a second chance. With endless love and faith in your futures, Nana Eleanor. At the bottom was a postscript. P.S. Alex Kumar, if you are reading this, welcome to the family. Matilda chose well. Alex's surprised laughter mixed with Matilda's tears. Even from beyond the grave, Eleanor had managed to orchestrate the perfect moment. How did she know? Alex asked. She was watching, Derek said softly. All those years when we thought nobody cared about our choices, she was watching and believing we could be better than we were. Morrison handed Matilda one final document, the Foundation's board structure per Eleanor's wishes. You as executive director, Derek as legal counsel, Alex as program coordinator, and, he paused dramatically, Carmen Rodriguez as community outreach director, if she accepts. Carmen's mouth fell open. Me? But I'm a nurse. Who spent 6 months coordinating resources for Derek's family while he was in treatment? Who organized the volunteer network that made this housing project possible? Eleanor researched everyone in your life, Matilda. She believed in all of you. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the new facility's windows gold, Matilda felt the weight of the past year settling into something like peace. The little girl who'd craved her parents' approval had grown into a woman who understood that the only validation that mattered came from living according to your values. Derek was rebuilding his life one day at a time. Alex was planning programs that would help hundreds of families. Carmen was designing outreach initiatives that would transform how the city addressed homelessness. And Eleanor's legacy was growing into something larger than any of them could imagine alone. The dollar bill from her parents' will still sat framed on Matilda's desk, but it no longer represented rejection. It represented the moment her real life had begun. The moment she'd stopped waiting for others to define her worth and started creating it herself. Standing there surrounded by chosen family and biological family, by dreams made real and futures full of possibility, Matilda finally understood Eleanor's greatest lesson. The true inheritance wasn't money. It was the courage to choose love over fear, service over selfishness, and hope over despair. The foundation would help thousands of people, but Eleanor's real gift was teaching them that helping others was how you saved yourself. And that, Matilda thought, as Derek put his arm around her and Alex took her hand, was worth more than $20 million could ever buy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.